You're listening to the Wired for Impact podcast. I think one of the most scary parts of that story is how you really were set in the right trajectory initially on. A lot of potential, smart kid, had dreams of being a doctor, and within months, you're sucked into this culture that had a grip on you for quite some time. That's a very scary thing. I think that's a scary thing for a lot of parents when they are trying to raise kids. They're doing the right thing, or at least they're doing the best they can. And to have that happen so quickly, what advice would you have for parents who have children at that age right now, and they're worried about possibly having them have the wrong connections, the wrong relationships, and get pulled into something like that?
Really a great question. It's one of the things that inspires my work today. You know, when I got out of prison, I knew that I had a responsibility to my community, and most importantly to the kids in my community who were growing up in similar backgrounds. And so I began to work very early on with schools and work with kids who were growing up in abusive households and environments where poverty was rampant, drug abuse was rampant. But what's really been interesting to me is that, you know, when I talk to kids, and I talk to kids from every class strata you can think of, you know, kids who are in private school, kids who are in public school, you know, kids who grow up with all the abundance and wealth you can imagine, as well as kids who grow up in poverty. And what I found is the through line that I would say to parents is, you know, you have to be intentional about creating space to have real conversations with your children. And once you begin to close that door to where your child doesn't feel that they can come and speak with you, then you're opening the door for them to speak to people who don't really mean them any good.
Mm.
When I reflect back on being seduced into that culture, and I intentionally use that word seduction.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I do it is because the culture is very predatory toward vulnerable children. And what happened with me was, you know, this man, he saw that I was disheveled, you know, my clothes were dirty and dusty. And, you know, these predators, they pay attention to kids in the neighborhood. They're looking for the next victim. They're looking for the next drug mule, the next, you know, prostitute that they can, you know, influence. And he zoomed in on those things, right? It was like, hey, I'm going to take you to get something to eat. I'm going to take you and help you get some clothes and provide you with a place where you can shower and do all the things. And so early on, it was very manipulative in the sense that he offered up this sense of security, which I think most children are looking for, security and acceptance. So what I would say to parents is keep the doors of communication open, take your ego out of it, you know, remind yourself that you were a teenager at one point, you were a kid at one point who was curious, who was fascinated with, you know, the things that existed outside the house. So, but I believe if you keep those doors of communication open, check your ego, and realize that these kids are on their own human journey. You know, you're at an advantage because now you're the most trusted person that your child will turn to. And, you know, I think that the tragedy of myself is that, you know, I just didn't have that communication level with my parents where I felt like I can trust saying to them, hey, these things are hurting me and they're impacting how I show up in school. They're impacting my experience with other human beings. And, you know, so now what I do as a parent and as a mentor is I make sure that no matter what I think about a thing, that I check that and really recenter my energy on my son and those who I am, you know, responsible for mentoring.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so important to emphasize the need for children to be seen and heard. And to your point, when they don't feel that, when that's not happening, and frankly, even just the attempt of it, I think if mom and dad took some time to just try to meet and connect, a child receives at the very least some of that intentional love. But to not feel seen and heard can be a slippery slope. And like you said, when there's predators out there looking for you, and you were looking for that too, like you said, you were looking for a safe place, you know, someone to receive you, and so that's a very dangerous potential. One of the things that was really interesting about your story was when you were in prison, when you had that realization that you dealt with abuse, and that you initially grew up thinking, like I think a lot of kids think, you don't necessarily have the perspective as a child yet to know that, this is kind of a shitty situation. And we don't really realize that until we get a little bit more mature. Walk us through what that realization was like when you were in prison and realized, oh, wow, I actually have been dealing with a lot of abuse at home.
when I began to even be able to call what I experienced abuse, it was, as Oprah would put it, an aha moment.
Mhm.
It's one of those moments where I was, at this crossroads. I was on about my ninth year in prison. I was in solitary confinement. And I had got a letter from my oldest son who told me that his mother told him while I was in prison. And it was devastating. It was devastating as a dad to think that my son would grow up to see me as a monster. And so I began this kind of reconciliation of how do I, answer this burning question of how did I end up here? And I was reading philosophy. I'm a big fan of philosophical thinking, and I was reading Socrates' Apology, and he talked about the unexamined life not being worth living.
Mhm.
So I was like, I've never really examined how I ended up here. And so I began to journal and just, really kind of chart the path from my early childhood. When was the first time that I remember being hit, for something that was minor? And that ability to say, hey, that was actually wrong. And that shifted how I thought about myself, the devastation from my parents separating, the emotions that I attached to that. I began to realize that my dad being out of the house was the first experience of not feeling safe and secure.
Mm.
And so that journaling process and getting to the truth and giving myself permission to just write all the things down, I think it's one of the greatest powers we have as adults is to really go back unapologetically say, hey, this is what happened to me. Here's what I'm responsible for, and here's how I want to live my life moving forward. So I highly encourage adults to
Mhm.
journal. It's so important because what I realized through that process was that I had stuffed so many things down and I had internalized all those things. I thought that, love came with pain. My mother, when she would, beat me, would say, I'm doing this because I love you. And it made me
Mm.
very paranoid, very insecure. I wasn't confident in my ability to make decisions without fear that if I made the wrong decision, it was going to result in, a beating or a punishment. And as I began to journal and unpack that, I was able to reassign responsibility. I was not responsible for those hits. I was not responsible for the things that were said to me verbally. I was not responsible for my parents' separation and ultimately their divorce. And it was one of the most liberating things I've ever done for myself because from there, I gave myself, a tabula rasa, like a blank slate, the ability to say, I can chart a path forward based on who I know I am, not what the system thinks I am, not what, anyone who would judge me solely on my worst moment would think I am. But I have this opportunity right here to write a new script. And that's what I began to do.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wired for Impact. If you're interested in creating and expanding your impact, be sure to visit us online at impactnow.com.